Hey you guys, welcome back to this week's video. I'll be reading some more articles to you today. I found one from the same website as last week's video, and I thought I'd read that one, and then I also found some other articles from different websites to offer a different perspective on the topic. So it wasn't all just science related, but I still feel it's all connected, and it's interesting to see it from different points of view. So the article that I came across is called "What is Thought and How Does Thinking Manifest in the Brain?" It seems a little bit like a stoner topic, if you know what I mean. So it says, we can describe different kinds of thought and how they arise to some extent, but the relationship between neural activity and the nature of what we are thinking isn't well understood. We're all at it all the time, yet thinking, or how we should think about thought, is surprisingly hard to pin down. When I did a vox pop, for instance, a couple of friends described thoughts as wispy things, and others saw them as sparklers fizzing with chaotic flashes, but containing a central light source that is controllable, all of which is decidedly unscientific. But then even the experts aren't so sure about what thoughts are, and what we can surmise from the latest neuroimaging studies suggests we may never truly pin down how they manifest in the brain. The short answer is that no one really knows what thought is, says Tim Bain, a philosopher at Monash University in Australia, and author of Thought, A Very Short Introduction. Even so, it is useful to consider two aspects of thought, he says, their content and their nature. Kalina Christoph's definition does exactly that. Thought is a mental state, or series of mental states that has some kind of content to it, with some personal attitudes towards the content, like an attitude of remembering or believing or imagining, says Christoph, who runs the Cognitive Neuroscience of Thought Laboratory at the University of British Columbia in Canada. First, let's consider content. Thinking isn't the same as perceiving or sensing, all involved holding something before one's mind, so to speak. But thoughts are distinct in that they are independent of any stimulus produced by the thing being thought about. In terms of how they arise, Christoph identifies three streams that feed into our consciousness to instigate thoughts: exteroceptive, from the outside world; interoceptive, from your organs and internal physiological environment; and conceptive, a term she uses to describe input that wells up from the subconscious in the form of spontaneous thought, including mind-wandering or daydreaming, as opposed to intentional thoughts such as reasoning and problem-solving. Within content, there is form. There are 5 main kinds of thought, according to Russell Herbert at the University of Nevada in Las Vegas, who invented thought sampling, in which volunteers record their current inner experience when prompted randomly by a beeper. This process reveals that a thought can be verbal, visual, emotional, founded in bodily sensations, or unsymbolized, none of the above yet still distinct, or a mixture of these. There's enormous variation between individuals in terms of how they think, says Hilbert, even if many of us fail to recognize this. As for the nature of a thought, or what thoughts look like in the brain, Christoph uses functional magnetic resonance imaging to explore this. For sure there are neural correlates, she says. Some of the brain activity simply reflects the kind of thought being had For example, a visual thought will show activation in the visual cortex. More surprising is what happens prior to spontaneous thought. About 3 seconds beforehand, there is activity in parts of the default mode network, which generally fires up when your brain is idling, and also in brain regions associated with memory. The latter have unusually diverse connections, which might help explain why spontaneous thoughts are so eclectic and arbitrary. Neuroimaging can give us a general idea of what someone is thinking then, but Christoph doesn't believe it will ever accurately interpret the subjective experience of thinking and thus make it possible to read people's minds, something that has been touted as a goal for the brain-computer interfaces being pursued by Elon Musk's Neuralink, among other companies. The mind emerges out of a physical substrate, the brain, and the relationship of emergence is not deterministic, she says. So this next article I have is from the Psychology Today website, and even though it's from the perspective of psychology, it does have a good explanation for the physical processes that go on in the brain when you're thinking about things. It actually goes into a lot more detail than the first article. And then the next article goes a bit more into the cognition side of things. What actually is a thought, and how is information physical? Google the word thought and you will find this uninformative circular definition. An idea or opinion produced by thinking or occurring suddenly in the mind. The Merriam-Webster dictionary defines think in a similarly unhelpful way, to form or have in the mind. But what actually is a thought? A thought is a representation of something. A representation is a likeness, a thing that depicts another thing by having characteristics that correspond to that other thing. For example, a picture, image, imprint, or mold of an object is a representation of that object. A map is another example of a representation. The mind is a kind of map. The brain and its functional product, the mind, evolved as a map of the body's relation to its external environment. Fundamentally, our thoughts are maps representing and corresponding to things that our brains have either perceived with our senses, felt with our emotions, or formed as an action plan, e.g. forming an image of reaching for a ripe fruit on a tree branch. All of these are electrochemically mediated processes. Thoughts may be fleeting, or they may later be consolidated as memories. Memory too is a physical process, encoded by structural molecular changes in neuronal connections. Let's consider are transduced by the sense organs into neural signals. Let's consider how sensory perceptions are transduced by the sense organs into neural signals. Imagine hearing a clap of thunder that surprises and frightens you. The sound of the thunderclap is transformed from a specific pattern of sound waves in the air to a corresponding pattern of vibrations transmitted through your eardrum and the small bones in your middle ear to your cochlea, to a corresponding pattern of electrochemical impulses along the auditory nerve, to corresponding signals in neurons in the auditory cortex and association cortex. That's a pretty detailed description, isn't it? It also activates fear circuitry relayed via the amygdala, and perhaps also visual circuitry that records what you saw at that moment. Signals are transmitted between neurons by chemical neurotransmitters. the entire widely distributed network activated throughout the cerebral cortex by this stimulus is the experience at that moment. Since this was such a strong stimulus, a flashbulb memory moment, the pattern of connections in this particular network is then made permanently retrievable. This happens by changes in membrane proteins at the connections between all the participating neurons that fire together in response to that stimulus. Neurons that fire together wire together. Hebb's law. This constitutes the memory. The same approximate network can be reactivated in the future by a reminder, some association cue. The pattern of connections is a representation, a map, corresponding to the pattern of information that you perceived. It is likely also interwoven with representations of other feelings or memories that you associate with that experience, adding layers of meaning to the experience. Modern information theory has taught us that information is a physical entity. Rolf Landauer, an IBM physicist, stated the case. Information is not an abstract entity, but exists only through a physical representation, thus tying it to all the restrictions and possibilities of our real physical universe. Information is inevitably inscribed in a physical medium. Elsewhere, Landauer explained further, information is not a disembodied abstract entity. It is always tied to a physical representation. It is represented by engraving on a stone tablet, a spin, a charge of elementary particles such as electrons, a hole in a punched card, a mark on a paper, or some other equivalent. So too, no thought can occur without its neural substrate. Information is the pattern of organization of matter or energy, the way things are arranged in relation to each other. Consider computer code. Differences in voltage in the computer's circuitry, conventionally represented by ones and zeros, represent different alphabet letters when associated with each other in particular patterns. The letter A is represented by 01000001. There's nothing inherently meaningful contained in a particular voltage in an isolated part of an electrical circuit. It's from the association or pattern that information emerges. Likewise, there's nothing inherently meaningful in the arbitrary symbols that comprise the letters of an alphabet or in the sounds of the individual words of a language. They assume meaning only in relation to each other and in their pairing or association with real things in the world. Just like the letter A encoded in a computer circuit, your memory of your grandmother is not contained in one neuron, a grandmother neuron, as opposed to, say, a President of the United States neuron. There's a vast network of often distant neurons that, in their connections with each other, collectively represent your grandmother memory. One particular neuron might perhaps encode a tiny memory fragment of your grandmother, let's say just one visual aspect of one particular facial contour. That is to say, that particular neuron will fire electrochemically when paired with visual input matching that contour. Nor is that one neuron dedicated solely to holding that piece of your grandmother memory. The same neuron probably participates in a great many other memories by virtue of its membership in a host of different connections with other arrays of neurons. Furthermore, different aspects of each memory are associated with a multitude of other memories. Aspects of your grandmother memory might be associated with your memory of a particular kind of apple pie. Thoughts of a more abstract nature are just higher level representations. They are built from hierarchies or ladders of representations, i.e. representations of representations. Abstract thoughts are in essence still fundamentally just maps corresponding to the external environment and the individual's position in it. A map is an analogue of the environment it's depicting. It corresponds to it. An analogue is something that is similar to or comparable to something else, either in general or in some specific detail. Maps can be regarded as a form of analogy making. A is to B as X is to Y. Cognitive scientist Douglas Hofstadter and psychologist Emmanuel Sander suggest that all thoughts are built from analogy making. They propose that categorization through analogy making is the driving force behind all thought. Our brains detect similarities or correspondences between newly and previously encountered situations, enabling the application of previously learned information to the new situation. The very essence of an analogy is that it maps a mental structure onto another mental structure. Language is replete with examples of the ways in which thought is built from analogy making. Our words for things that don't exist out there in nature are built from words that represent concrete things that we can perceive with our senses. Here is a sampling of some of the simpler analogies, metaphors from Hofstadter and Sanders' elaborate collection. The legs of a table, the spine of a book, the tongue spoken by the islanders, the window of opportunity for doing something, the field one studies, a marginal idea, salaries that fall within a certain bracket. Similarly, our 5 major senses are recruited by our language to describe abstract phenomena in familiar physical terms. For example, one can be touched by a kind gesture, struck by a beautiful scene, or hurt by a jabbing remark. Or one can taste the joy of victory, find a movie to be tasteless, be in a sour mood, or make a bitter remark. Happiness and unhappiness are represented in vertical space, to raise someone's morale, to plunge into despair, to be very down. Abstract notions are often conveyed through comparisons to familiar human activities. Her experiment gave birth to a new theory. The facts speak for themselves. A religion dictates certain behaviors. His fatigue caught up with him. Elsewhere, Hofstadter explored the question of how, through self-reference and formal rules, systems can acquire meaning despite being made of meaningless elements, and how the psychological self emerges from abstract feedback loops or self-reference symbolic representations, recursively reflecting on itself in a reverberating circuit, a cybernetic loop. Quite a dizzying concept. The neuroscientist Antonio Damasio proposed a model for how the self emerges in gradations, in organisms of increasing evolutionary complexity. According to this model, a simple organism develops a rudimentary form of self-awareness by forming a map of its body and its position in the physical space it occupies. Damasio calls the most basic representation of self the proto-self, a non-conscious state that many species may have. It's a very basic level of awareness comprised of neural patterns representing or mapping the body's physical structure. Since thoughts are physical and have spatial dimensions, each thought being represented by complex connections between large arrays of neurons, you might wonder if it's possible to read a person's thoughts from their brain's patterns of neuronal activity. In fact, scientists have already been onto that project for several years. The brain requires an inordinate amount of energy to do its work, utilizing 20% of the body's energy consumption at rest, despite accounting for only 2% of the body's weight. The brain's rate of caloric burning increases when engaged in cognitively demanding tasks. Energy and mass are interchangeable, E equals mc squared. Since thoughts are energy signals, the ions and molecules encoding the energetic signal have mass too. But can we actually calculate the weight of a single thought? Certainly it would be an infinitesimally tiny number, but not zero. In summary, information is physical and relational, and we are networks of information. Thoughts are not ethereal. They're representations of matter and are encoded in matter. They have shape and weight. Abstract ideas are analogically built from more concrete sensory representations. The sense of self is built from self-representations. Thoughts are forms of information, and all information is physical and relational. It feels like something to have a thought and to be a self because we are that information, recursively reflecting on itself in an infinite regress. That's a very interesting way to put it, isn't it? Because we are that information. It's still not really getting to the depth, maybe not depth, but we all, as thinking creatures, we all know that there's more to it than that it's more than just this physical firing of things in the brain. Just the idea of how this fleshy, squishy, fatty tissue in my head and your head can make these visual things that we can perceive and see, but we're not really seeing it in front of us, we're just seeing it up here. And what about thoughts that seemingly come out of nowhere, that might appear in our head and we think, like, I don't think that at all, that's horrible, or it's just out of the realm of your beliefs and seems just like this bizarre concept when you think about it. So the next article goes into a little more cognition part of thinking. And I like this one because even though it's another psychologist who wrote this article, the concepts that he talks about open the door to more spiritual ideas and concepts. And that really resonates with me because I've done a few sessions in therapy, like probably a lot of people have. I found it was like I needed more. And I think the component that was missing for me was the spiritual aspect of things, some deeper meaning. And that's what the missing piece was for me. And since I've incorporated that into my life, I do feel a lot more peaceful now than I used to, for the most part anyway. So this next article is called What is Thinking? What if all written knowledge in the world would disappear? What if you were the only one to know about this and you had the opportunity to save 5 books from vanishing? Which ones would you choose? Why these? What would you do with them? As you read these questions, your mind is probably working hard, even if your first reaction is disbelief, like this could never happen. It likely still elicited a response from your mind. We all engage in thinking daily, and it's a constant presence in our lives. It encompasses a variety of activities such as rumination, analysis, fantasy, problem solving, and storytelling, and we have little to no control over it, although some may argue otherwise. However, this article will not focus on the content of our thoughts, but rather on the nature of thinking itself. Interestingly, there's no universally accepted definition of thinking. It's a complex phenomenon that involves cognitive, emotional, and sensory processes, and can be approached from various perspectives, such as neuroscience, psychology, philosophy, and even software engineering. Each of these fields thoughts has its experts and opinions on the matter. In this article, we will first have a look at the objective nature of thinking, biology, then venture further into the subjective nature of thinking, psychology. On my own bias, since I am a psychologist, my mind has been mostly habituated with thoughts from these schools. I often describe thinking as mental habits, processes that try to become automated through continuous repetition. More on that later. Thinking is an intricate process that has long captivated our curiosity. At its core, thinking is a product of the mind, a repository of thoughts accumulated over a lifetime. Yet the mind finds its physical residence within the brain, one of the body's remarkable organs, akin to the heart, liver, or lungs. There's much to be said about the interplay between these organs, but neuroscience looks at the brain mostly in isolation and is one of the most dominant influences on the way we think about intelligence. The brain's infrastructure is composed of neurons, specialized cells that conduct electrical impulses and communicate chemically with their neighbors. It's through these intricate neuronal networks that the magic of thinking unfolds. Here are some fascinating insights from the realm of neuroscience that will be relevant to understand the experience of thinking. Efficiency through experience. Neuronal networks frequently used become remarkably efficient. This optimization happens through a process myelinization, where fatty insulation wraps around these neurons, dramatically increasing the speed of communication. These well-traveled neural pathways resemble mental highways, streamlining our thoughts, even if they don't follow the most direct route. The rewiring potential. Neuroplasticity, the brain's ability to rewire itself, is a revelation. It implies that our brains aren't fixed entities, but malleable structures. Negative patterns can be unlearned, and positive ones can be cultivated through deliberate practice and conscious effort. This offers hope for those seeking to change entrenched thought patterns. Emergence and complexity. From the simplicity of individual neurons emerges the complexity of brain structures. These structures give rise to our personalities, desires, and goal-directed behaviors. The remarkable aspect is that an individual neuron, minuscule on its own, contributes to the grand tapestry of our experience. From a deterministic perspective, the brain operates like a meticulously set domino lane. Researchers have uncovered studies suggesting that brain activity can predict decisions before individuals are consciously aware of making them. This has led to the notion that free will might be an illusion, as every biological process could theoretically be foreseen with all variables being known. That's very interesting. But within this deterministic framework, a fascinating concept emerges: free won't. While we may lack control over our automatic, unconscious patterns, we retain the power to choose not to act according to them. This conscious intervention may pave the way for a deliberate rewiring of thought patterns and behaviors. It's important to acknowledge the intricacies that this simplified view doesn't capture. The brain's complexity extends beyond neurons and myelinization. It involves neurotransmitters governing mood and attention, and it operates at various frequencies of communication. I've chosen to highlight these points because they are well understood and are helpful mechanisms to know when trying to look at the subjective nature of thinking. In a nutshell, individual neurons can emerge to larger, complex networks. Neuronal networks become efficient through repetition and even though accompanied by resistance. Even these ingrained highways can be changed or rewired. Embodied cognition is a contemporary framework in psychology and cognitive science that asserts cognitive processes are profoundly influenced by the body and its interactions with the environment. This perspective challenges the traditional belief that cognition is exclusively a product of the brain, instead emphasizing the role of the body in shaping our thoughts and perceptions. It does not oppose the idea that the brain is involved in thinking, but rather asserts that it co-evolved with the body, making it deeply influenced by bodily experiences. In my experience, this framework offers a highly practical and effective approach to engaging with cognition and its interplay with emotions. For instance, when you are anxious, you may experience a racing heart, muscle tension, shallow breathing, and other physical sensations. Simultaneously, your thoughts will significantly differ from those in a relaxed state. Becoming aware of the array of bodily sensations accompanying the experience of anxiety can be tremendously helpful in refraining from engaging in thoughts and behaviors associated with anxiety. From the lens of psychology, it's not the underlying mechanisms behind what we think constitutes thinking, but the underlying experiences and functions of thinking. While there are different schools of thought too, most would agree that thinking is an active process through which individuals construct knowledge by interacting with their environment. Jean Piaget differentiated between two different processes, assimilation and accommodation. While assimilation involves the incorporation of new experiences, accommodation involves modifying existing schemas to fit a new experience. This translates into first, thinking as a tool of pattern recognition, learning, problem solving, and idea generation, and second, as a tool to make meaning and tell stories, mostly about our life. Second, as a tool to make meaning and tell stories, mostly about our own life to make it seem coherent. This part of the article I find interesting because it relates to the next article that I'll read. It's taken from an Eckhart Tolle video clip that I took the transcription from that. And there's a comment that the person asking him a question makes at the end that describes thinking as a tool to help you understand any subconscious feelings you might be having that you're holding on to, and the thoughts that arise, even if they seemingly come out of nowhere, are a good indicator of that. When you can observe your thoughts for what they are rather than becoming overtaken by them, possessed by them, they can be really helpful. Anyway, moving on. Our minds are fantastic at recognizing patterns and then making the desirable patterns more efficient, faster, easier, and unconscious, just like habits. From an energy perspective, habits are incredibly resource-efficient ways to solve an evolutionary problem. Like habitual scrolling through our phone to solve the problem of getting a reward for new information, it's more resource efficient to not have to put thought into every action that involves pulling out our phones, unlocking the screen, opening social media, and so forth. Since emotions seem to be a huge driver for neuronal networking, these habits are especially easy to build if an undesirable feeling can temporarily be replaced by something lighter. In the same way mental habits can be born, stories we keep telling ourselves become internalized. Thoughts about things we like or dislike become habitual, and ways in which we approach problems in life or at work become repetitive. We fall into the same pattern over and over again and lack creativity, thinking outside of the norm. This also implies that thinking is not strictly rational, as we would like to believe, but more of a belief than we would like to think. Thinking is believing because we build mental habits upon already existing structures we have believed to be true in the past. Interestingly, we are mostly unaware of this. We do not know what the alternative would hold. Often we are even afraid to think about it because it would interfere with our existing mental models. And on top of that, it requires effort to think outside of our ingrained patterns. One thing that the mind seems to be very good at is the solving of problems. Think of the question at the beginning of this article. Face the mind with a question and it will inevitably try to find an answer to that question. It will likely do so by drawing on past experiences. What books have I read that would be valuable for the entire world? It might also ask further questions to stimulate new thoughts. What parts of society would be most and least affected by the absence of written language? Who would suffer? Who would be better off? In our internal monologue, the questions are posed from our mind itself, though. It does not seem ideal if the party posing the question is also the one to answer it. Some would call this a conflict of interest. This can be one reason why we can get stuck in thinking, and why coaching or generally talking to other people can be valuable. They might ask questions our mind has never thought of before and stimulate it to generate new outputs, some of which might be useful enough to become assimilated and increase the quality of our lives. It doesn't change anything about the fact that our minds can be incredible at solving problems if we just let it openly generate ideas without judgment, which are often a set of thoughts that constitute a belief. Most of these ideas will likely be useless, but some might be game-changing. It's interesting to note that there's one thing that AI cannot mimic, at least not yet. Artificial intelligence is great at logical thinking with higher speed and fewer mistakes, but it lacks the ability for inefficient thinking. This type of thinking is what can lead to new insights. Throughout history, innovative ideas have played a major role in advancing society, even when they appeared unproductive or inefficient at first. Light bulbs were frowned upon at first for being an inefficient and expensive way to produce light. Just like we can observe the phenomenon of emergence in the brain, from neurons to networks to brain structures, we can observe the concept of emergence in the mind. We can go from a single thought to constructs of thoughts to entire personalities to multiple personalities. Each level adds a new layer of complexity to the human experience. When I say multiple personalities, I'm not talking about multiple personality disorder or other mental illnesses, but the mere fact that we as humans often have contradictory opinions in our minds. We may have a part that wants to be independent, show its work, influence others, and be successful, but at the same time we have a part that wants to be secure, held in the warm embrace of dependency, and hide from the world. Each of these parts can have its own thoughts and feelings, even different voices and postures without contradicting the larger nature of the self. As we construct our reality by interacting with the environment, we build up certain reactions, thoughts, behaviors, and feelings that are congruent with the current environment. But environments change. As we grow up, we take on different roles. The way we communicate with others or ourselves can drastically change depending on the environment. It would be awkward to have the same construct of thought online, during work, visiting our parents, or talking to a child. When it comes to personalities, many of us have an inner narrator that we've become acquainted with. This voice is always there, narrating our experiences to us in the form of an inner monologue. It's like we're telling a friend about everything we've done today or in the past. Most psychologists would consider telling our own story as a means to bring coherence to our lives and add more internal consistency. By doing this, we prevent ourselves from being victimized by the randomness of the world and instead place ourselves at the center of it. I have made this decision and I am in control. Let's assume we had an upcoming project that involved public speaking and got cancelled. Our narrator might sound something like this. I've always been bad with speaking in front of people. I'm glad that project got cancelled. It could have been a disaster. And now I have more time to catch up with some friends. Now let's assume that the project didn't get cancelled. Our voice might sound something like this. Public speaking has always been so uncomfortable for me, but the reward I got was always greater than the struggle. This is going to be an amazing opportunity to grow. I can't wait to tell my friends about this. In crafting stories about our lives, the narrator tends to tailor them to align with our current beliefs. This can be beneficial as it allows us to imbue meaning into our decisions, especially when we're in good mental health. Given that many of our choices lack clear-cut right or wrong answers, such as whether to switch jobs, we may subconsciously or consciously modify the story we tell ourselves to justify our decision as correct. This example is an optimistic narrator with a growth-oriented mindset. However, these stories sometimes end up being considered as chatter or lies we tell ourselves, as John Frederickson puts it, which don't always benefit us in the same way. Often enough, these mental habits can be dysfunctional, degrade the quality of life, and be a hindrance to our higher selves. One way to do so is by leaving the stories we keep telling ourselves unchecked. Although these stories may seem true, it's often because we repeat them to ourselves. However, they may not be based in reality. We may portray ourselves as independent and hardworking, but fail to acknowledge the dependencies we've created by neglecting important responsibilities we've been putting off for a while, such as our relationships or health. We avoid acknowledging these parts because they don't fit the narrative we want to present, so we ignore them and keep repeating the stories we want to hear. Continuous repetition leads to automation, which means these mental habits become unconscious and effortless. We create shadows by shining only partial light on a fake story and begin to project them outwards. This can result in a world full of individuals who appear lazy and dependent on others. This is commonly known as the story gap. It measures the distance between the story we tell ourselves and the reality we experience. This gap is strongly linked to our level of life satisfaction. When the gap is wider, we tend to suffer more. We become haunted by our insecurities and are triggered by anything that doesn't align with our ideal version of reality. On the other hand, when the gap is smaller, we experience inner peace and are less affected by external events. This results in a happier state of being. Another way when thinking goes wrong is manifested in chatter. Continuous rumination, thought loops stuck in the past, or worry, thought loops stuck in the future, stuck in our heads. Ethan Kross described this chatter as a loss of perspective, a narrowed zooming in that makes us lose the bigger picture. One common reason for getting trapped in negative thought patterns is misusing our problem-solving abilities. As we've previously discussed, our minds generate answers when posed with a question, which can be helpful. However, it can also lead to negative thinking. For example, if we ask ourselves, "Why am I unhappy?" our minds will try to find reasons and justifications for our unhappiness. This can create a negative story in our minds that reinforces our unhappiness. However, asking about the why behind the habits we value can be beneficial. For instance, asking yourself, "Why do I want to exercise?" can reinforce the idea that exercise is beneficial and help build a habit of regular exercise. A much bigger contributor to chatter, however, is the distance between I and thought. Simple example: I'm miserable, I'm depressed and unhappy, I cannot get my life right. Or, I'm having thoughts that keep telling me how unhappy I am and how little I can do about it. Both are telling the same story, just from a different perspective. The first story is told from the perspective of thinking, and the second from the perspective of the one who experiences thinking. While neuroscience offers insights into the physical processes, and psychology unveils the intricate narratives, both perspectives fall short of capturing the entirety of this phenomenon. what I was trying to say before, but didn't really express it articulately. And lastly, to follow on from that article, I wanted to recite a video that Eckhart Tolle has on his YouTube channel where he attempts to answer where thoughts come from. So the woman asks the question because she has thoughts that she recognizes as not her own, or possibly patterns that have existed for years and years, like jealousy or competitiveness or being threatened and fear. These kind of things that keep us up at night. Where do they come from? Eckhart answers that the Buddha was asked a similar question, and he gave this parable. Someone shot you with an arrow. You've got an arrow stuck in your body, and before you remove it, you're trying to find out why and where it came from. What he was saying is our main concern should be to remove the arrow, instead of trying to find out where it all started. How did it start? Where did it all originate? The arrow stands for suffering, any form of suffering that is self-generated through the mind. There is such a thing as a collective mind. So many thoughts are not your thoughts really. They arise in the collective mind. They're energy fields or energetic entities that you could almost think of as little bubbles floating around, which is not literally true, but say there are these thought forms floating around, and if it discovers any resonance with anything inside you, for example, any form of negativity, just a slight irritation of what someone said today, this even heavier thought form of negativity will attach itself to you, and the irritation has become something bigger. So you connect with the universal mind, and it moves through you. When we deal with our so-called own minds, which is far more than our own mind, whatever awareness arises in you is not just your benefit. It has an impact on the totality of the collective mind. It's not just a personal thing, in the same way that any thinking that takes possession of your mind is not really personal. It pretends to be personal, but it's the human collective mind. In the same way, any emotion generated by that, it looks like your emotion, but it's either anger or sadness or jealousy, which is the same in everybody when it arises. It attaches itself to slightly different stories in the mind of why I'm angry, but anger is anger. It's not yours. You pick it up and then it gets hold of you, and many humans live with a mind that has taken possession of them. It pretends to be them, and they're stuck with it without even knowing it. If they knew it, it would be the beginning of freedom. But if you tell them they are, then they get angry. They don't, but their mind does, because it feels threatened. You can see how collective thought forms take possession of an entire country, like Soviet communism in Russia, Maoism in China. Millions of people are thinking the same thing. And even in our society, it's not necessarily one monolithic thought form such as that, but there are different thought forms. Through the media, they can perpetuate it, and without knowing it, our most basic assumptions, how we interpret the universe and the world around us, are thought forms that come out of the collective and take possession of us. And that's all fine in itself if there is an awareness. But if thought is all there is, it becomes destructive and insane without awareness. And the next question you have would probably be why? But then that goes back to the arrow parable. I've always liked that idea of thoughts being little bubbles going through the air and then they attach themselves to you. I think of that with creativity at times. Like you'll hear an artist explain, they often feel like they were just channeling something. They weren't thinking consciously about anything. That also gets into the idea of intuition and all these different things. So yeah, it's a very complex and interesting thing. But when I was looking up these things, I did find the Alan Watts website. It was a transcript called Mind Over Mind, and I started reading it just to see if I could add anything to this video. It's just a whole nother perspective on it. The very food for thought, Alan Watts type of material. And I thought maybe I would read that for a video as well. One day, maybe. Next time, maybe in a few weeks, I'm not sure. So, I might end this video now, guys. Thank you for tuning in as usual. Super stoked that the last video did well. So welcome to all the new viewers, and shout out to all the day ones as well for sticking by me and supporting me this far. Yeah, more videos to come, and I will see you next time.